Good afternoon. I'm Denise Milne, and I am a Senior Manager in Alberta Children and Youth Services and co-chair of the FASD Cross-Minister Committee in Alberta. So I have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Marie Dewhurst today. So welcome to her session on forensic assessments of youth affected with FASD. Before I introduce Dr. Dewhurst, there's a few housekeeping tips we need to share with you. One, all sites have been muted at the bridge, but please ensure your little handheld headphones is on mute. Also, we're trying something new today, which is if you have questions for Anne-Marie, please feel free to email your questions to cys.fasd@gov.ab.ca. Again, that website that you can email questions to is cys.fasd@gov.ab.ca. And we will give your questions to Anne-Marie closer to the end of her presentation. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please let your local site contact know, and they will follow up accordingly. As part of the 10-year strategic plan for FASD in Alberta, education and training is really a critical aspect. And so it is through that strategy that we've really promoted the video conferencing learning series. So you've seen a number of posters at your various work sites where we're having up to 23 learning sessions in this fiscal year, 09-10. Today's session, we have 72 sites on board, attending from British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, NWT, the Yukon, Nunavut, and we also have Ontario on board today. So we have about 150 participants for Anne-Marie's session. So I'm going to now introduce Dr. Dewhurst. Anne-Marie is a registered psychologist who specializes in assessing people in trouble with the law, and she has a number of clients that are both adults and youth. She's worked in both the provincial and federal correctional institutions as well as outpatient forensic clinics. She also has a private practice in Edmonton, and she enjoys teaching as an instructor with the grad program at Athabasca and Concordia. So I now would like to introduce Dr. Anne-Marie Dewhurst.
Okay, this is my first attempt at one of these sections, so I'm going to look that way and hopefully include people, but the sites are going to change. Every 15 seconds I'll be looking at new people, so if I don't make eye contact, that's probably why. I really encourage people to send in their questions as we go. I have a little bit of attention deficit, so I can handle being interrupted, and I'd rather have them as we go rather than wait till the end, so feel free to do that. I feel a little bit awkward being presenter at an FASD video conference because I'm not a specialist in FASD. I'm a forensic psychologist. And because I'm a forensic psychologist, most of my clients struggle in some way or another. And because I'm getting old, what I'm finding is that many of my clients, I've seen the patterns often enough that I started to realize what it was I was dealing with. And FAS is definitely one of the big issues facing most forensic facilities. So I've done my time in federal prison and realized that many of the clients I was working with were FASD adults. And now that I'm in the community and doing much more work with children and family services, I'm learning a whole lot more about adolescents who are in trouble with the law and how often FASD is part of their experience. So our goals for this workshop are to sort of look at forensic assessment, because so many of our youth are coming through court systems and are getting ready to be sentenced, and we want to look at what is in their best interest and how to understand them properly. So a forensic assessment is an important piece of that. And when you have an FASD-affected youth, we want to be really clear of how those two diagnoses, the issue of crime and the issue of brain capacity and behavioral issues around for this youth, come together. We want to look at executive functioning because that's often where the biggest deficits are for our youth, and when they have FASD and how they're interacting with their environment and how crime comes into that. And then how do we structure these, the recommendations we make to courts, and how do we supervise these kids to set them up for success? So I'm going to be reading off my notes because I can see you or you can see my slides. You can't have both. So all of you hopefully have the handouts in front of you, where they're available. In the
You have to do what slide you're on.
I haven't started yet.
Yeah, but
Oh, okay. Okay. Thanks. The first thing, I just wanted to ground us. So there's a slide that says FASD and behavior problems. Streisguth and her crew, this is going to be 10-year-old data now, they were talking about secondary characteristics associated with FASD youth. And they found like 50% or 90% of FASD affected youth had mental health problems. 60% had been suspended or expelled from school. 50% or more had problems with substance abuse, and over 50% had been reported for sexually inappropriate behavior, and at least 30 of them had had significant treatment for substance abuse. When I was reading those characteristics, what struck me is that's very common for kids in conflict with the law. So when you look at a young offender center, you're describing the population. So I'm not saying that all young offenders have FAS, but a good number of them are probably struggling with the issues. So when we look at crime in particular, it's a secondary characteristic. So what happens when you have a lack of impulse control is you do bad things. You get into trouble. And because you don't have necessarily the decision-making skills to think on your feet and be effective, you get caught. And so our kids that are FASD affected are more likely to come to the attention of police or community people because they are often the people who are left standing at the scene of the crime. Or they're the people who are talking about it later because they don't know how to keep a secret. Right? So it's often difficult for them to manage the impulse control, and they have a hard time thinking about what could happen next. So that future thinking is a difficulty for them. A whole bunch of the things that prevent people from committing crime are often areas of struggle for FASD youth. So for example, having empathy. So often we don't commit crime because we know it hurts somebody, but empathy is a skill that FASD-affected youth often struggle with. They don't have necessarily the sense of the difference between me and you. And so it's just stuff, or they buy into beliefs and cognitive distortions quite quickly and easily. Delaying gratification is really hard for many youth, so they see it, need it, take it, rather than think about it, save up their money, and buy it later. Right? So there's that delay of gratification problem, and good judgment making is often impaired. There's also a tendency, because of some of the biological aspects of FASD, just handling emotion is difficult. So we often see episodic explosive kind of reactions. So people go from calm to extremely distressed and then back to calm again quite quickly. And so that puts them at risk for violence and fights. And again, vulnerability to peer pressure. And it's often a unique vulnerability because they're often looking for a lead, somebody to sort of guide them out of this situation. And we hope our youth get connected to positive role models. That's not always the case. And so they'll go with the crowd a little bit easier. So when you think about FASD and youth, it's just and youth and crime, they go together really nicely. So when we go to try and help the kids, it's really helpful to take a look at both issues rather than ignoring both or just paying attention to one. Forensic assessment is a unique kind of assessment. And I just want to break down a little bit about the different kinds of psychological assessments that there are and then how forensic assessment fits into that. Before I just go into that next piece, are there any questions? Any questions from the sites? Not yet. Okay. I'm going to ask that quite often. I read the notes for how to prepare for this, and every 10 minutes, ask. So we'll try. Okay. So the most common assessment that people are used to with psychologists is the achievement assessment. Most kids in school get achievement assessments, and they're very focused on, can you do it? And are you going to be able to do it? So if we teach you this stuff, how likely are you to go ahead and put it into practice? So that's often about, how well can you read? how likely are you to pick up welding, that kind of stuff. And that's often where our youth, our FASD-affected youth, can often do quite well because of the spectrum of the disorder. You'll have kids that have deficits in different areas, and that's not in and of itself a helpful standalone assessment. So the next piece that often gets layered on is intellectual assessment. So we often look at the IQ of somebody, so their capacity to understand their world, and to look at the skills and abilities and just basic capacity to go forward into the world. And so that's a helpful thing to know as well. And again, there's great variability with FASD-affected youth. Many of the kids that I see are actually in the normal range for IQ. So that's, again, when we're looking at how to help somebody with crime and the disorder, it's insufficient. Neurological assessment, I don't know how it is in other parts of the country, but most of the youth that I see have not had a neuropsych assessment. Neuropsych is looking at the specific parts of the brain and how they're working, and how do they work together. And so for many of our youth that are FASD affected, parts of their brain work fine, other parts don't, and sometimes it's the connections between the parts of the brain that are flawed. So parts are missing or parts are not where they're supposed to be. So neuropsych assessment is very handy to tell us what's happening at a structural level and also at a capacity level. Personality assessments are really helpful in saying what's this person's style. Now, sort of IQ is helpful. We know that there are people with a low IQ that do amazing things because they just have a social ease or a comfort with different parts of learning. So we need to know a bit more, and the personality assessment helps. And I'm going to come back to that because there are some personality styles that are correlated with crime. And so we want to look at that specifically with FASD youth. But all of those kind of things are those kind of assessments would help somebody just being in the world, not necessarily if they're involved in the courts. And when we look at the courts in particular and kids that are in conflict, we want to really be able to help them navigate that system. So we have to use tools and structure our work so that it helps deal with the specific focus. And that's where forensic assessment comes in. So a forensic assessment is very much of a specific question around competency and criminal responsibility. So I can have all sorts of competencies or capabilities as a youth, or a youth can have that kind of general ability. But how do those abilities affect crime is the question, and their likelihood to commit another crime. So we need to understand the child in context. So we want to find out, particularly, is this person lying to us? So when we talk to a youth, we want to know the difference of, is this kid lying, faking bad? Are they trying to deceive us? So we want to know more about that. And a lot of people pretend to be worse than they are when they're doing kind of assessments with us because they think it might help them get away with things, right? So we want to check that. We also want to know about risk. And one of the things we know is that the least effective way of determining somebody's risk for further crime is the therapist's gut. So over the years, we have developed risk assessment tools that are really helpful. And Canadians have actually been at the forefront of the development of most of those tools. So we are in the thick of things, and it's a good way to be because it helps us focus our questions. How likely is this child or this youth to get into this kind of criminal trouble again? And we also want to know about the psychological factors that are correlated to criminal behavior. So for example, I have worked with a lot of people who are annoying, aggressive, verbally run at the mouth, and are in your face and angry. But that is so you want to avoid them. And then it comes time for a decision. Should we let this person back into the community? Should we reintegrate them now? And the gut says, lock this person up because they are so annoying. But our research says they may be annoying, but they're not likely to do another criminal act. So we want to actually separate the pieces so that we're not reacting to people from that gut, and that we inform our gut well and take it where we need it to. So I'm looking now at the slide that says the difference between forensic and general psychological assessment. There are some differences. The first one is very focused. It is very much of a narrow-scoped assessment. And sometimes, I have to tell parents, no, I'm not going to do an IQ test, because IQ isn't actually a risk factor for committing crime. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. And so even though the parent wants to know their child's IQ and thinks that it's a factor, I would say no. I might do some observation of the youth interacting with people, but other time not, depending on the risk factors. Okay. A forensic risk assessment is not necessarily client-centered. So I know that's an important thing when we talk about client-centered interventions. The client is actually not the focus, because it's the question the courts have that is driving the assessment. It is the community's need that drives the assessment. And the youth is sort of like the data we mine to get an answer to that question. And that feels kind of hard, right? And the feminist in me that says that the person is not the problem's the problem, sort of has a hard time with that. But it's about being objective. And the best way to help that person is to look at them in context. So the feminist in me goes and quiets down, and then we go forward. But that perspective is really important, because a lot of the times our clients aren't really all that interested in participating, right? Because they have a problem with compliance. Many of the kids that we work with have the oppositional defiant disorder label, which to me really means that they've got an attitude that I have to somehow work with. Or they have the conduct disorder label, which basically tells me they've done stuff and got in trouble for it. So we have to work with that. But they don't necessarily jump up and say, assess me, please. Okay. They're not voluntary, necessarily. And that has a whole bunch of ethical issues attached to it. So we have to be very careful in doing a forensic assessment to make sure that the people who can give consent are giving consent, but also that the youth is giving what we call assent. So they're under 18, they can't give consent on their own behalf, so that we're working with people to make sure that the impact of assessment is understood before we start. So for example, if I go to do a forensic assessment, I'm often working with defense counsel so that they understand what's happening for their client. But the Crown often learns of the assessment existing because we've talked to family or friends. And somebody will tell them the assessment exists. So then, it's a matter of being out there. So we have to tell parents right up front, or caregivers, that there is a likelihood that this assessment may end up in front of a judge, and that it won't have come from me, but somebody might say something. And here are the consequences of that. So you need to think through before we start. And often we won't proceed with a forensic assessment until the youth has consulted a lawyer, because the lawyer is the person who's most able to speak to their legal concerns and their court-related needs. Because people aren't really jumping up and down wanting to participate, we have some validity issues. So a lot of times, the FASD-affected youth are quite impulsive, and will just sort of get in, and they'll score the tests or they'll respond to assessment randomly or carelessly. There also may be some issues around just whether they'll participate at all. So we have to really work with gaining compliance, and for people to be set up to work with their disorder. So for example, when I hear somebody telling me outrageous stories, and I have a suspicion that they're FASD or I have a diagnosis, I will ask questions to find out if the person is deliberately lying or if they're confabulating. The confabulating is telling me the story that they think I want to hear because they know that something should be said now, or they think they're in trouble, and so if they say something, they'll get out of trouble. So we really spend some time talking about the stories that people give so that it's all in context. And sometimes the kids will try and fake good and have no troubles, and they'll try and pretend to be like their peers. And that is something that we look for in terms of doing assessments as well. Okay. The forensic assessor is different than an IQ assessor or somebody, because often we're looking at developing a rapport when we're just doing assessment. We're wanting to work with the kid and get an ongoing kind of relationship. With a forensic assessment, it's often a one-shot deal, that the kid comes in and there's one day of testing, assessment, and then they move on. And that's connected largely to the pressure to get things done for the court in the deadline. Now, we try and break that up and see kids more than once so they have the best opportunity to put their best forward. So if you get them on a bad day, that's not your only option. But a lot of times that's a luxury. And so it's a uniqueness to this kind of assessment. Also, a lot of the assessments are done in institutions. So you're getting the kid in a sterile environment that they're not comfortable in, limits of privacy. So if I'm doing some assessment in my office, I can shut the door and nobody can look in and see what's happening. When I'm doing an assessment at the Young Offender Center, there's guard staff walking by. There may be somebody outside the door who is there to supervise. And so it sets up a different kind of dynamic. And what we're looking for is also, do they understand what's going on? A lot of youth have trouble with understanding the court system. A lot of adults have trouble understanding the court system. But a lot of times with kids who are FASD affected, they really don't know what this is about, or they understand it in one sense, sort of superficial level, but not how it actually applies to them. And that's a real difficulty. The other thing that is unique about FASD affected youth and assessment, especially when you have these time limited, is that they don't always understand time. And so they don't show up. So we'll have to chase them again, or rebook and rebook. And for most of us who have regular client contact, that's not such a problem. But if you're in the community waiting for a youth to show up and they miss their appointment time, they may have missed a good chunk of their opportunity to be assessed properly. Okay. The other issue that we're looking for in a forensic assessment is the youth's capacity to understand right and wrong. Now, this isn't just at the moral level, but at a very sort of grassroots level. Do they have a consistent understanding? Do they have an integrated understanding? So if they know something is right or wrong in an intellectual capacity, but with peer influence, they do it anyway. So they might know it's right or wrong and not have the ability to apply that. But they have to have, at the end of the day, the ability to participate in their own defense. And so part of what we're trying to establish is, does this youth have that ability? Or can we inform the caregiver or the guardian of what the youth's abilities and capacities are so that they can make a good informed consent? And that actually is one of the issues that we face, is that sometimes our FASD-affected youth have guardians that are FASD as well, or are impaired in terms of learning disabilities, or in terms of their ability to use the data coming forward. So we have to look at that. So we're taking all of this information that we gather, and then we're trying to put it together in a way that is going to be meaningful to the user of the data, which is the court system. And so we want to make effective recommendations to the judge, and we want to have that hopefully influence in sentencing, so that the sentence for a crime fits the youth's capacity to learn from that sentencing and to be forward-thinking. So we need to also think about the youth's ability to testify on their own behalf. And we know that memory problems are a significant issue for many FASD-affected youth. So we want to look at those kind of issues and see if the memory impairment is such that they are not a good, reliable source of information about themselves. We want to be able to make sure that that is taken into account when people are questioning them, and especially when they're giving testimony. Okay. A specifically relevant issue is, as I said earlier, the idea of, is this youth going to do this again? And we're going to talk a little bit in the next piece here about the tools we use to determine that. But we do want to have that information before the courts, because that will definitely influence sentencing. And then we also, if not only want to influence sentencing, but we want to influence the conditions under which a youth is supervised in the community, because that can set the youth up for success or failure. And we want to make sure that we work with the youth's strengths and abilities rather than building supervision strategies that the youth is likely to fail in. Okay. So forensic assessment is different. It may also be connected to other kinds of assessment. So for example, if I have access to IQ data, to neuropsych data, to achievement tests, I will use all of that information, but I won't necessarily go out and generate that kind of test data, depending on the question used. I'd like you to imagine yourself as Sam's, I'm going to give you an example here, but you're Sam's probation officer. Okay? So I'm going to just, I don't know if some places people might be alone, so this might be a solitary exercise, but here I want you to talk amongst yourself for a few minutes about how you would start asking for an assessment for Sam. Okay? So I'm just going to read you some of Sam's characteristics, but I want you to think about what you would want to know if you were the person who's going to have to supervise Sam in the community. Okay, so Sam and his two friends were arrested for robbery and assault with a weapon. They were caught robbing youth at West Edmonton Mall's bus depot. There's a whole big bus complex where there's lots of youth. They had threatened youth with knives. Sam was the more aggressive of his peers, and he was the one that was doing a lot of the gangster talk, you know, sort of real tough, macho, kind of down-with-it attitude. And he was the one also doing a lot of the grabbing of people. He grabbed his victim. He punched one guy in the stomach and held his open switchblade to the throat of another. I don't know if this sounds familiar to anybody, but this is sort of a condensation of many kids, so it's not just one person. His history is that he was exposed to parental neglect, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and his mother's drug addiction. And part of his mother's drug addiction is that she would use alcohol often to sort of soften the landing, you know, so when she was coming down, or to sort of enhance the ride as she was using. So alcohol was pretty much consistent through her whole pregnancy. Sam watched his mother overdose and die at the age of 5. And he was placed in several foster homes, both familial and stranger. So they started off with family and tried to keep him in with his cousins, and that didn't work. And he was eventually replaced with the regular foster system. And at about the age of 13, he was taken into a facility that is meant to stabilize youth. So it was more of an institutional care. And he's now in a group residence, and he's 14. So the behavior stuff you see is just defiance and aggression towards the caregivers with no cause. So it's like out of the blue, he sort of loses it. There's lots of violence, and not just directed at people, but he would break things like chairs and walls and things like that. Often when he was denied privilege, or when he was denied something he wanted, he would respond by yelling and swearing. And lots of headbanging as a youth, and lots of risk-taking as an adolescent. So this is a kid who would take a skateboard and fly down a railing and sort of see where he landed. And he also uses drugs. He prefers marijuana. He does it every day. And ecstasy is kind of fun. And if you give him something, it looks interesting, why not? It's a pill. Pills make me happy. I take it. So he has a real sort of lack of self-protection there. He's got he's in the low average range of IQ, and he has difficulty with impulsiveness, shifting his focus from one task to another, and he struggles with emotional control. And he has attention deficit disorder. In terms of his personality, he's been diagnosed as having a conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. He is neurotically acting out, so he's kind of all over the page and often with some anxiety. He's very much of a follower, assessed as having low self-esteem and impulsive. So that's sort of his personality. So this file lands on your desk, and you're the probation officer that's going to have to do the pre-sentence report and the supervision to follow. So just in and among, does that fit for anybody here? Okay. So if you were in that situation and you know that Sam has had this background, what would you want to know? Now, I know the people in the other sites are going to talk amongst themselves, and this group is going to talk amongst themselves, and it will be broadcast. So what would you want to know? Does he have a diagnosis of FASD? That's one. Anything else?
Has he had a type of treatment?
Okay, what has his treatment experience been, and whether it was effective? Okay. Okay. We had any comments from they're silent everywhere. Okay. Well,
I want to know more about his strengths.
okay, so what's going right for Sam? So what are some of Sam's strengths? Okay. So let me ask you sorry.
I'd also like sort of a detailed family history. Where's biological dad?
Okay, where's his dad?
More information about mom's history, mom's parents, dad's parents. I'd like sort of a generational look at this.
So you'd like a generational look at the whole family and know more about where dad fits into this.
Yeah.
Okay, those are really important questions. And actually those are some of the ones that are asked in forensic assessments very specifically. Often, when I was trained in the dark ages as a psychologist, I was taught to get the genogram, the family tree, and a whole bunch of information. And then we encountered the generation of FOIP, so the Freedom of Information and Protection Acts, and the need to have a reason, evidence-based practice. You have to have a reason for any data that you collect for a client, and you have to be able to link it to your purpose. And so that really shook us for a bit because, I'm used to getting all of that data. Well, the good news with this kind of forensic assessment is that it is actually relevant information. It may or may not be relevant for many other questions, but for here it is. So I'm going to ask a different question. If you were thinking about Sam being on probation and actually finishing a probation term, given what you know now, what would you think? What's your prognosis? He's going to breach continuously. Yeah, does anybody else have a sense of what might happen? Yeah, we don't need a risk assessment to tell us that. We know he's going to be back before us again. So that's a starting place to sort of know that what we're trying to do is give information that will help that not happen and help people think in a way that will help him. So for example, often we expect youth to participate in standardized treatment programs, and we expect them to adapt to the program and it's a one-size-fits-all program. And we know that that's not necessarily going to work for somebody who has FASD, and so we need to restructure the environment to match his need. So the risk assessment tools that exist for just youth offenders in general actually work very well for FASD-affected youth. And they provide a very good comprehensive assessment tool. The one I like the best is the SAVERY. It's a structured assessment risk for violence for youth. I think it's a Canadian tool. It's coming to us out of Ontario. It's very well referenced, and it's not a test that you tabulate a score and it says, this person is statistically going to do this percentage of offending. But what it does is it says, here are the things that we know are connected to youth doing violence. And this is, if we look at these variables, we will be able to figure out the likelihood that this youth is not just going to get into trouble again, but are they going to get into trouble with being violent again? Are they going to get into trouble that can be, with a good safety plan, prevented? So these tools, they target those things that are directly relevant, and they avoid things that aren't, so that we don't get our guts leading us astray. It sort of keeps us online and helps us to figure out where to go first. So there are three different sort of categories that we look at. One is the historical and sort of the static, the things that won't change for the youth. So we do want to get a good look at their background, but not just an unstructured chronology of their life story. We are looking for very specific issues. Same with the social and contextual risk factors and the individual and clinical. So what the SAVERY does is helps us look at the youth in their context and in the context of a multi-generational kind of experience. So I actually wanted to go through this tool a little bit carefully with you thinking about Sam, right? Because I think it is helpful to sort of look at what we're looking for. So because we know that he's impulsive, so any kind of impulsive behavior, criminal or not, is likely to happen. But what we're looking specifically at is violence, because that's what kids get into trouble for, and that's often why they end up in front of a judge. So what is their history of violence? So we want to know, have they done this before? The best predictor of future behavior is still past behavior. But we also want to look at their nonviolent offending behavior. So what is it that this person does? Do they have habits of getting into trouble? When did the violence start? I was doing a file review for a case that I was working on, and when I'm working in institutions, to have 2.5, 3 inches of file is quite common. This was a community case. A kid had been in a group home, and every time there was an incident where the child had to be held, a report was made. And it was really interesting because we went through, and I started doing a chart of the report on that. What we found is this kid has been violent since 2. But the way it got recorded in the file, it was the same behavior. Would often get grouchy, would start agitating, would start yelling, and then would hit something or someone. That behavior was documented when they were a 2-year-old. When they got to be a 14-year-old, it started getting recorded as an assault. But it was exactly the same behavioral description as what the kid was doing when he was 2. And when you have FASD affected youth, that's a really powerful way to look at how the brain issues are affecting behavior and risk. So we're seeing that kind of early not able to manage arousal and being impulsive has affected the youth. And it is important to start naming that and sort of looking at the violence in context. We also want to look at past supervision or intervention failures. How well did this person do in a mainstream treatment program? So we know that often that's difficult for kids. So when we're using these tools and an FASD affected youth, if I don't know the youth is FASD affected, this is a flag for me that they failed in supervision or programs. I just ask myself a question about that. If I have a diagnosis, that one is just time to start inserting that information into the report already. History of self-harm or suicide attempts is another issue. Many of our FASD youth are quite reactive and are engaged in self-harming behavior. What this sort of tool looks at is, let's put that self-harming behavior into context. Is it actually self-harming behavior or is it self-soothing behavior? So for example, headbanging has many different interpretations. And so what is that about? Cutting also has different interpretations. Sometimes, especially young girls, will cut in rage and sometimes in depression. So having that kind of history of the self-harm and starting to talk about it will often at this stage start differentiating between somebody who is aggressively acting in or who's just struggling to be okay in the world and is looking for tools. And then exposure to violence in the home. What we know is that family violence exposure, especially in young children, can actually do brain damage, right? We have all the neural pathways that develop, and there was a new term I learned the other day, allostatic load. It's the measurement of the actual impact on the brain by being exposed to uncontrollable stress in the environment. So I was kind of surprised by that because there's a whole research field that I haven't read yet, but it's the actual proof that family violence causes harm. So that's an interesting one. And so when you're already organically impaired, then to have to witness violence. It adds confusion, and it takes away from being able to figure out how the world works. So we're using that information to build a discussion of this youth that includes their disability. Childhood history of maltreatment also makes it into the review of the historical factors. And the criminality of the parent or the caregiver. So if we're working with somebody who comes from a long line of criminals versus somebody who's coming out of a system where everybody's pro-social, that's really important in terms of a lot of FAS kids will follow the leader. They'll follow the most powerful person in the room. So we want to be able to speak to that and say, if you expose them to different leaders, will their behavior change? And often it does. We also want to look at early caregiver disruption. So early caregiver disruption is correlated with crime, period. When you look at the histories of FASD youth, often caregivers change repeatedly. Often, once they start school, you see a rapid succession of changes, at least the ones I've been working with. So you see probably more disruption than the average youth. And again, we need to continuously link these kind of issues with the diagnosis. The other piece is poor school achievement is correlated with crime. It's also correlated with FASD, an FASD-affected youth experience. So what we're doing often when we're not paying attention to these issues is we're setting up children to be involved in crime. So we're increasing their likelihood. And so those are the historical factors we look at. There are lots of other things we might want to know about a youth, but these are the ones that are actually correlated to crime. And so what you can see from looking at that is that the deck is kind of stacked because of the things that correlate with the diagnosis for involvement in crime. And then we interject into the social context, or social and contextual risk variables. So again, we're looking at peer delinquency. So if you're hanging out with kids that are bad, you're more likely to be bad. And one of the things that we noticed, and we've noticed all along, is we have the wonderful thing of West Edmonton Mall, and it is the mecca for homeless or street-oriented youth. We have other parts of town where people congregate. But it's interesting when I hear my clients talk about the mall. It is a safe place. It's open 24 hours. You can hang out there, and they're incredibly good at hiding from security. But it's a place where people hang out, and a lot of homeless people sort of live. And there's a whole sort of social structure that goes along with that kind of environment. The population of red deer walks in and out of West Edmonton Mall every day. It's like thousands and thousands of people. And they have all of the issues that you might have with a whole city, but it's under a roof and with free parking. So it's very accessible. So kids go there. And what happens for a lot of the youth that I see is that they find people who accept them. Gang-related stuff is so appealing to FASD youth because nobody expects you to be good or perfect. You don't have to meet any standards. And if you tell somebody where to go and how to get there, nobody reacts really strongly. You might have a bit of a tussle as you sort of establish yourself, but the inclusion is really, really effective. And so a lot of that social stuff that these kids are looking for happens in sort of this kind of environment, and then they get bored. So we have a group of kids that are easily including of others, and then they get bored, so they're looking for something to do. So shoplifting, assaults of other youth. To make things even better, we throw in an amusement park. So we get lots of vulnerable youth coming in thinking they're having a good time. And so we have some more streetwise kids sort of having lots of opportunity to practice some of the antisocial skills. So it's kind of like a nice little training ground. So we get a whole lot of things happening. Now, I'm not saying that West Edmonton Mall causes crime. Really, I don't want to diminish a tourist attraction, but it is an interesting place to study. But peer delinquency, peer rejection, all of that social stuff is really connected to recidivism. Stress and poor coping are, again, if you haven't got good coping skills, You're more likely to act out violently and reactively. And if you don't have good parental management, so if your parents aren't adding the boundaries and sort of limiting you, you often end up with poor ability to contain yourself. So a lot of our youth, at least the ones that I'm seeing, are in the process of going PG or permanent guardianship. So their birth parents haven't lost parental care rights. They're in transition to foster care and back and forth. And discipline from parents is often in transition or part of the problem that brought them into care in the first place. And just the lack of personal and social support is also an issue we look at. So one of the questions in assessment that I ask the kids is, who loves you because you breathe? Who is there for you no matter what you do every time? And it's an interesting question because 9 times out of 10, people have an answer for me. Right? And that's a good sign. That's actually one of the things I look at in terms of resiliency. But they're only social supports if the child or the youth sees them as social supports. And if they can't name their social supports, then they may be there, but they may not be somebody that the youth will rely on or go to. So we want to know about that. And then again, community disorganization. If the community that they're living in or the environment they're living in is a mess, they're more likely to be involved in crime or in violent activity. Okay. Any questions so far? Have no idea if I'm boring people.
And Eric, do you want to check? Announce the website again? Sure.
What is the website?
It's CYS.
CYS.
.FASD.
At gov.ab.ca. So if you have questions, please feel free to email. Okay. So the other thing we're looking at, sorry, get back in the frame, is the idea of the actual individual's risk factors. So what are connected to the individual that link them to crime? So negative attitudes. So, that sort of, I don't want to do it, and you can't make me attitude is connected. Risk-taking, impulsivity, substance abuse and substance misuse, anger management problems, low empathy or remorse, attention deficit, hyperactivity difficulties, poor compliance with supervision, and low interest or commitment to school. Those are the risk factors that continuously show up in the literature as linking youth to crime in general and to violent crime in particular. So, for people here who work with FASD affected youth, how are those in terms of being applicable to the group you work with? That's sort of like the definition of my caseload, right? So when we're looking at forensic assessment, again, the things that are likely to be noted in the general population are particular areas of vulnerability for FASD-affected youth. And so if I haven't had a diagnosis previously, this is often when the diagnosis red flags start coming up and the need to refer and collaborate. Because these individual factors are usually what are documented most on file and are usually the things that people are encountering in terms of managing the youth. And so they're most likely to be seen as the youth's problem. And so when we look at this kind of profile of the youth, what we want to do at the end is sort of look at the big picture and then also look at what is supportive of this youth. What are the protective factors? So for example, are they in a pro-social environment? Do they have strong social support, whether they recognize it or not? Do they have strong attachments and bonds? And this is often the case for people who they may not be able to live with their family, but they have, we want to know, do they connect with a former foster family? Is there a teacher or a caregiver or a mentor that they have in the community that they're strongly attached to? And what's their attitude toward intervention and authority? So we have some kids that don't want to hang out at all with programs, and then there's some that really think it's fun. And so we want to look at the ones that, seeing that as a positive protective factor. And then some of the kids, even though they're not doing well, have a strong commitment to school. And so that's a protective factor. And some of them are just amazingly resilient. And they're still ticking. And you sort of want to look at that and say, what is it that's helping with that resiliency? So we take a look at all the risk factors and all the protective factors. And what happens is you get a clumping. Somebody will either be low risk, moderate risk, or high risk for criminal and violent recidivism. And that's what we want to speak to very specifically. And when we have the diagnosis sort of either as a hypothesis or as a diagnosis, we want to make sure that those risk factors are discussed in terms of the youth. And one of the things that we've done on some of the cases that I've worked in is that court gets delayed because a diagnosis has a hypothesis that this kid is FASD affected. And the delay happens until the neuropsych assessment can get done. So then the programming can be made much more effectively. So sometimes you might need to go back to a different kind of assessment to inform the risk. Okay. These are really powerful tools to use in court because it allows the judge to focus specifically on the criminal element of the child's life and not get wrapped up in the social developmental piece. So you take the social and development information and you pull it in and you give it and connect it to the risk for crime so the judge is still in their realm of expertise. And the probation or parole officers can know how to do their job based on what they need to know. And it answers the questions. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Some people have gone to court with general assessments. What we know is that general assessments aren't particularly helpful for those kind of recommendations. They're just not specific enough. And if you think about this Savory and how it's very holistic, it allows the youth to come forward and not be blamed for their behavior, but it holds them accountable for their behavior at the same time. And that's a really important distinction. Nobody should be expected to live above their capacity for an extended period of time. We ask FASD youth to do that all the time. And we have often we're seeing kids breached. And so one of the things that adult risk assessment tools often look at is failure of supervision. So if we set somebody up with a probation sentence, for example, that involves a curfew, and we know the youth has a hard time with time and forgets, has a bad memory. So they don't plan properly, so it's 10 o'clock, they remember because their watch beeps or something that they have a 10:30 curfew, but they're on the other side of town and they have no bus money, right? So we've just, because of the curfew limitation, the youth had planned to be home, wanted to be home, knew it was important to be home, but because of their other issues, doesn't get there. And that's the night that the probation office calls to confirm the curfew compliance, and the youth isn't there. And often those systems are you're there, you're not. There's not a lot of room for context. So we wouldn't want a youth to have such a rigid, an FASD-affected youth, to have such a rigid curfew because we know that it's not going to fit with the way their brain works. So we want to have a different kind of contact that's much more collaborative with the caregiver, that allows the youth to use their strengths. So for example, if they call, if they know that they remember that they needed to be home, they remember that, but there's a barrier that sort of goes along with their pattern, it wouldn't necessarily result in a breach. It could result in some skill development. So use it instructionally rather than punitively. Okay. One of the tools that we find helpful, it's along the same lines. It's called the Youth Level of Service Inventory. That one is a bit more statistically oriented. You'll generate a probability factor. So for example, if with the level of youth level of service inventory, we're still looking at pretty much the same categories of information, but it's going to give you that this youth has a 49% chance of reoffending in general recidivism over this length of time. So it helps place them a little bit more statistically on the reoffending map. And for some people, that can be really helpful. And in some cases, when you're trying to argue sentencing with the opposition, the lawyers in opposition, it can give you a little bit more data. Okay. Another tool that I like to use is called the Justness Inventory. It's a personality measure that is deliberately designed for work with criminally involved youth. Now, have you heard of it before? For those who know? Okay, it's its strength is that it has discussion of group and peer relationship as one of the things that it looks at. So what we know is that a lot, as I said earlier, youth are looking to affiliate, and that sometimes that's part of the motivation to become involved in criminal activity. So when we're looking at assessing youth, we really want to understand, why are they involved in this crime? And if you look at your slides, it's towards the back. I think it's the third last page. They got a little, or took them out of order. I shouldn't have done that. And I didn't number them. But it's toward the second half of the thing. It's the JIR. So, and I didn't number the pages. So, but the Justness looks at personality, but in relationship. And so when we're looking at these youth, it would be helpful to know more about their ability to connect. This will inform supervision strategies really nicely. So they look at maturity, for example, at this inventory. How mature is this youth compared to peers, the same age group? And what we often find is that there's an immaturity because they're naive. The FAS-affected youth are often quite naive. They're introverted sometimes, and otherwise, it's not that they're shy necessarily, but they're self-focused and internally focused. Sometimes we're going to see withdrawal or anxiety or depression, and the tool really looks at those kind of personal issues. But then again, it looks at, is this person sort of got the personality style, the beliefs and attitudes that go along with being a gang member? Does this youth have the sort of buy-in to pro-social sort of beliefs? Are they looking at an active or a passive kind of engagement with their peers? And are they the type of kid that's going to manipulate? Are they setting up traps for people so that they can get their needs met? Because a lot of our FASD-affected youth are very good at going around things to get what they want. They're not good at asking for what they need verbally, but they're incredibly adept at getting some needs met. So we're looking at, particularly in relationship to their peers, how do they function? And how adaptive are they to their environment, to their social structure? And so the Justness gives you some of that information. It's not a tool we use outside of the forensic world in general, but it does have some real advantages. Another tool that we use is the Psychopathy Checklist. Now, this is an important one for violence. The higher your score is on the Psychopathy Checklist for youth, the more likely you are to engage in violence. And it looks at interpersonal, affective, behavioral, and antisocial categories. I'm not going to take you through all of the risk indicators, but one of the things that is good is if you get a high score, restrictive measures, really strong containment is really helpful. Because these are the kids that don't care and will do things that scare most people. Now, many of the issues in this, on this checklist relate to things like empathy, lying, disorganized behavior, attention deficit, those kind of things. And so if you have the red flag going up of FASD, you may actually take somebody out of a psychopath kind of stream and put them into a more rehabilitative stream. This actually happened with a case I was dealing with last month, that the file said this, a child care worker had written, "This child is so evil." And they, imagine, it came up on a file, evil. Because the child was not remorseful, was quite cruel to animals, cruel to their peers, just really scared the worker. And I often look at files and look for fear words, because that tells me how vulnerable and helpless people are feeling in dealing with the youth. And that's also a flag for FASD, by the way, when I'm doing a file review. The helplessness of the people involved in the file is often an indicator that we need a neuropsych assessment. But when we're going through that, they had said this kid's a psychopath. And I could understand where the fear would get, because that's a powerful label. You know, you think immediately of the Bernardos of the world and you want to run screaming. I've actually met psychopaths, and a lot of the FASD youth seem to have some characteristics in common, but they're not, right? And so what it is often a real fear, and somebody wanting to make a statement about how dangerous this youth is. So what they're saying is that they're likely to hurt somebody. So taking them out of this label and putting them into a impulsive, angry, explosive, lack of self-soothing behavior kind of criteria helps everybody sort of get something else that they can do, and creativity comes back in terms of the caregivers, environments get adapted, and then the kid can move forward. And often the violence subsides. Not always, but or medication can get changed, and whatever is causing that kind of problem can be resolved. The other piece is lack of empathy is a big piece of what makes people start talking about psychopaths. And empathy is a skill. It's not just something that we have or we don't have. We can actually build empathy, but when we have people who have structures of the brain that don't work properly, expecting them to understand something as ethereal and abstract as empathy is very difficult. So we often have to change what we're looking for to match the youth's capacity rather than expecting them to do something that even high-functioning adults sometimes have difficulty with. So we often teach empathy, and we call it different things, like, do you know what this person's feeling? So, for example, we'll often in treatment use face recognition cards, the happy face and the label underneath, because youth, their inside experience and their external reality don't match. So how do they know what somebody else is feeling when they don't know what they're feeling? A lot of youth will mirror, and when somebody is mirroring, they will sort of reflect back. If somebody's frustrated with them, they'll reflect that frustration back, but louder, bigger, and then that person reacts to them, and it gets big. So we don't want to label that as a lack of empathy or as an incapacity to feel what other people feel. What we want to do is put it into context and help somebody learn the categories. And so we might spend more time in treatment focused on that skill. Okay. Now, how many of you are familiar with executive functioning and what the executive functions are? Okay. Yeah. It's one of those things that has started coming up more and more in day-to-day work. Basically, your frontal lobe, it's behind your forehead, and it's involved in all decision making. And that's where the ability to sort of regulate information, it's sort of the central control box. The orchestra conductor is often a metaphor used. And so it's taking information from all parts of the brain and trying to make sense of it. And the big categories of executive function involve the ability to initiate activity, so the ability to start something, so either good or bad. The ability to have working memory, the ability to plan and organize materials and plan and organize activities, to be able to self-monitor, to be able to inhibit arousal or impulses, to shift your focus, and to have emotional control. So that's what's happening in the frontal lobe. FASD-affected youth often have impairments in their executive functioning. So what we've integrated into our forensic assessments is a test of executive function. We use the brief because it's a very quick and easy kind of reflective tool, and it's also something we can get parents and caregivers to also fill in. And it's interesting, often our clients are very able to describe the problems they have if you ask them very simple questions. Like how often is your room a mess? Sometimes, never, often. And it's interesting, often our clients are very able to describe the problems they have if you ask them very simple questions. Like how often is your room a mess? Sometimes, never, often. And the youth fills it out for themselves, and their caregiver fills it out. And they're often very close. Usually the caregiver is seeing more of a problem than the youth. But it's really helpful because then we often have a place to start to talk about problems because the youth is starting to see things in a different way. But that information is really important for supervisors of a probation sentence or caregivers who are trying to get compliance. Because if you're trying to set up a strategy of supervision where the youth is having trouble managing their arousal, so they start getting upset, they get very upset, they calm down, it's over, and they're on to another thing, and it's like it never happened, because memory is also a bit poor, but everybody in the house is still reacting from how powerful that emotion was in the moment. So then people expect the youth to go back and dissect that reaction and sort of break it down into all its parts and study it and then do something different when they recognize it's happening. That's not a useful strategy. It's a very common offender rehabilitation strategy. It doesn't work here because it is gone. And so bringing the youth back introduces shame and frustration. And so what we want to do is then suggest other strategies about how do you know when you're getting upset. So if it is entirely reactive, so how do we change your environment so that you're not getting upset? The triggers aren't there, or at least the triggers are more manageable. Okay, so I'm going to get you to think about Sam again. So our FASD-related youth. If he is sort of assessed from a forensic perspective, with using the savory, for example, what we're going to see is that a lot of his story gets retold with a different lens. And one of the nice parts about being able to have that vehicle of the forensic assessment is that, first of all, your assessor should be aware of FASD and really aware of the brain functioning and how that fits. But being able to tell the story of Sam, so he's a kid who really is looking for leadership. He hasn't got a lot of strong direction, he doesn't feel safe in his world, and he looks for people who are going to fill him in. When he gets into a group of people that'll let him hang out, so he's at the mall and they're, including him, and he feels competent. So they start talking trash because they're bugging each other and teasing, and they give the idea that this would be easy to go and get the kids' shoes or get their iPhones. And so he starts thinking about things, and things get into activity very quickly. He's also figured out that it looks pretty cool. And if you look cool, people leave you alone. If you look tough, people leave you alone. So if you're sitting on the bench and you have your knife and you pull it out and you click it, so people know you have a knife, you don't usually have to use it because then you can put it away and you look tough enough so people back away from you. So he's got those kind of strategies because he doesn't have the ability to be assertive, to say, no, I don't want you to be here, or I want to leave. He's also got a real problem because when he wants to go someplace, it's really controlled. So he either has the freedom of the mall or a lot of the restrictions at the group home that he's in. And so, it's all at the all or none thinking. And he doesn't have things that he likes to do. He doesn't have a lot of activities or interests. He doesn't know how to have fun because he spent so much time bouncing around. He doesn't have recreational skills. So part of rethinking what's going on for Sam is to start thinking about him as a brain-damaged youth rather than a career criminal. So making that shift. Once we've shifted into a organically rehabilitation-oriented world, we can start doing some things that are really, really different. So for example, if I want to teach a youth anger management strategies, I can take him into a classroom, I can show him the sort of the posters on the wall, and a lot of our anger management programs are very verbal and literacy based. So I can teach him to do that. Or I can take him out to a golf course, to a putting green, and teach him how to putt. Or I can take him to a pool hall, which is kind of a cool place to hang, and teach him how to shoot pool. Both of those activities require calming. They require focusing. They require sequencing. They require some of the skill development that will help him build brain pathways. So rather than punishing him and saying, okay, you need to go to this class, what we want to do is build a relationship and then build an activity. The attention deficit, the part that makes it hard to stay in the classroom, and some of the learning disabilities are not going to be a barrier to him learning how to shoot pool. Shooting pool is a recreational activity that is likely to go into the future. And there are pool halls that are non-alcohol, or that you don't have to have a bar to have a pool hall. So all of a sudden we've got a new environment that he might feel comfortable in. Shooting baskets is another one. Again, it's an activity that in order to do well, you have to be calm and centered. And that is, a different approach, but it combines several of the social skills all at once. So in planning for Sam, for a release or for a probation sentence, I would be recommending things like a peer mentor, a mentorship group, so that he can get some of those skills. We know that he likes to hang around the mall, so he has a group of friends that are like him, that he feels are accepting and engaging. So we can't have him hanging out with the kids that he thinks are nerds, or whatever the appropriate term might be. But we want him to be around kids that he can identify with and feel comfortable with. And so a group of FAS affected adult or youth is hard to manage, but a couple of the guys together on a recreational activity with somebody who they feel the leader is somewhat like them is more likely to be successful than sitting in a classroom. So we can build that. Again, things like curfew placement, we really recommend that that be something that's used very carefully, because part of the problem with youth, FASD affected youth, is time management and planning. So they aren't going to likely be home on time. And we see so many youth get breached for failure to comply with curfew. And if what you're looking for is to keep them off the street and in a productive, in a safe environment, we have to get a bit more creative about how to do that, and to build in the kind of cues that would let that youth be successful. So for example, cell phones are wonderful things. And texting is cool. Kids like texting. And a lot of the youth that I work with have phones. I'm not always sure how they get the phones, but they have them, right? And they're whizzes at texting, because you don't have to spell well. And you have instant messaging. Also, they have, it's a connection to a social network. So what I encourage the caregivers of the youth that I'm working with is to not rely on a curfew, but to text frequently throughout the evening, and to use the social networking that kids think is cool and go with that flow. Now, depending on the youth, sometimes the phones get sold, so you don't want to spend lots of money on the phones, or they get stolen or lost or whatever. But having that instant communication allows you to remind the kid that curfew's coming. Don't spend your bus pass or bus money. Get to the meeting point. To do that planning with the youth, because they need the external brain. They don't have the memory system. They don't necessarily have the capacity to structure. Hopefully all of this will get addressed as part of the plan from the assessment, but a good collaborative assessment should get you to that point. Does that make sense? Does that fit with your experience? Right. A lot of the time when we're dealing with probation conditions, the judges are aware that this kid has been in front of them before and again, and they're looking for creative options. And so I'm often impressed with youth court justices and how flexible they are. And in an era of alternative dispute resolution and diversion and different strategies, it sounds not too harsh to sentence a kid to basketball, right? But that's in some ways what we need to be doing. So I'm going to switch stories on you. I'm going to ask you to think about Joe. Now, one of the things that, you might recognize Joe. Joe is 14, and Joe was found naked from the waist down with a 4-year-old girl who was also naked in a shed at the family farm. Okay? The girl was his niece, and the girl disclosed that Joe took her to the shed to play every time she came to visit her auntie. Right? So whenever Joe and this little girl were around, they would go in the shed and play. This is the kind of scenario that I get referrals on a lot. You get an FA-affected youth who has sex with somebody younger than them. And this terrifies people. And they want to know, is this kid a pedophile? And often it comes, the referral comes with a pre-diagnosis of this kid's pedophilic, and what do we do with them? It's really important to take a step back from that, and again to go into a proper assessment and to look at sexual activity by youth in context. And this is where the forensic assessment can really supplement what you're looking at, especially with sexually acting out youth. Now, how many here have worked with sexually acting out youth? Okay, half the crowd here. It is part that scares us the most. And this is often when we see with FAS youth at about when the youth starts going into puberty. We start seeing complaints about sexual aggression, sexual acting out. And so what we want to do is sort of look at the youth in context again. And so I'm just going to give you the rest of his story, and then we're going to go through and think about him from a risk assessment perspective. So Joe came into foster care when his mother was arrested for drinking and driving. Joe has 3 younger siblings to whom he is very connected. He's doing well in a modified school program, and he's involved in Sea Cadets and participates in Remembrance Day celebrations. I think 2/3 of the kids that I work with are involved in cadets. I like cadets. Joe gets into fights regularly at school. He has experienced 2 in-school suspensions. He's active on Facebook and claims to have over 200 friends with whom he communicates. Joe's foster mother caught Joe and his brother looking at pornography. Upon searching the computer's history, she found that he had been looking for girls. So, pornography involving girls. Joe's IQ is in the low normal range. He has been diagnosed as FASD. His memory is very poor and he has trouble learning new behaviors. He's often agitated and has difficulty calming himself when he gets upset. He's an anxious youth and is typically shy with his peers. He's easily upset and takes offense easily. He often complains of aches and pains and will complain he has a headache. And he tends to follow the rules but struggles to live up to his own standards. And he defers to authority and behaves unassertively if he's challenged. And he may react violently when he's trapped, when he feels trapped and unable to escape a difficult situation. So we've got a very different kid compared to Joe, or compared to Sam. So Joe is pretty much a normal, kind of high-functioning FASD youth, compliant, but every now and then he has his struggles. So if he doesn't see a way out, he may react violently, and he has this thing going on with his niece, which is serious and needs to be addressed. But again, in a context. Now, one of the tools available to us as Canadians, actually the world, but it's another good Canadian tool, it's called the Eraser. The estimate of risk for adolescent sexual offender. I should have written that down in full. Yeah, it's a risk assessment tool, sorry. It's Jim Warling out of Ontario has created it. It's standardized. It's very effective in terms of guiding people toward decision making. Again, it's an aide-memoire, so it gives you things to think about and to consider the vulnerability of this youth for reoffending in a sexual way. And we really want to look at sexual offending specifically and not just crime in general. Because as we sort of heard with Joe's story, he's not the kid that's going to be doing the B&E or the assault on a kid in the bus stop. He follows the rules. He's not likely to show up at the mall or hanging out downtown. His kid is involved in structured and quite comfortable in organized activities. And he's not antisocial, so he doesn't buy into that gang stuff. But he's got a lot going on. And one of the things that I often pay attention to when reading a file is physical issues. A lot of FASD children have difficulty with touch, are very sensitive to sound and stimulus, and that somehow people stop thinking about that often when kids grow out of that baby stage or the child stage. But what we want to know is, how is that child who has a historical FASD problem identified, how are they dealing with sensation now? So are they feeling bombarded by stimulation? Are they feeling like they're not getting enough? because that's often an issue. So what we'll look at with kids who are looking at sexual activity, they may be understimulated, or they may be looking for self-soothing. And they're looking to engage someone else in touch to supplement what they're lacking. So it may be that they're looking for physical contact and engaging a sexual strategy to get that, but it's always a question that I put at the back of my mind. So we know that the biological or the organic issues that affect children will come forward in life as they age. So it's a good thing to ask how. Okay. Where can a person find the assessment tools on the internet? Well, if you look up ERASOR on the internet as a keyword, and Worling, WORLING, Jim Worling, you'll get the eraser. It's public domain. He is the nicest man on the planet. He will share his information at the drop of a hat. He has family connections in Alberta, but no data collection source. He would love to collaborate with somebody in Alberta. He has connections in Saskatchewan, Ontario, BC. He just somehow skipped us. But one of the things about the eraser's flexibility is it can be used in a multicultural context. So you don't have to be a white, middle-class Ontarian to really benefit from it. And he'll send you a manual and a disc about how to score it, and he's really helpful that way. The other tools that I've been talking about, some of them you need to be a psychologist to access. Some of them you just have to have some university training. But MHS is a psychological testing organization, and they publish quite a few of those. So you can get them online. Some of them are cheap, like the eraser's free. Some of them are a little bit more expensive, like the LSI probably is $2 or $3 an application. Some of them are also available computer usage, like the Justness is available so that the youth can engage with a computer screen, making it much easier for kids to engage. Okay, so the eraser is again looking at very specific things. One of them is sexual interest, attitudes, and behaviors. So we know that sexual offending happens for a variety of motives. So offending is a classification of behavior. We need to understand what motivates the behavior in order to decide what to do about it. So for example, is this a deviant sexual interest? So if you have a 14-year-old youth, are they thinking that this child, this 4-year-old, for example, is their sexual preference? So is the shape and feel and touch and smell of that little child their sort of focus? Or is the child convenient and a warm body? Is this somebody who they feel intellectually matches their social development or their intellectual development? So they're seeing this child as a peer, even though there's a 10-year gap in age. So that's a helpful thing to understand. We also know that a lot of FAS affected youth get stuck in their head. They have a hard time shifting their ideas. So they get an idea and they go over it and over it and over it, a very obsessive kind of thinking. But it's not that they're necessarily preferring to be in that thought. They're just there. And so I would want to know, does this sexual behavior connect to that? Or is it something that they're actively fantasizing about and building fantasy versus reacting to a repetitive thought? Do they have attitudes that are supportive of sexual offending? So does Joe know this is wrong and get really sneaky about how to get to his niece and make sure that nobody finds out, and has got lots of excuses and sort of figured out how to make it okay? And when caught, is he willing or unwilling to follow along with suggestions? So when you think about Joe's history, if Joe got caught, what's the likelihood he would work with caregivers or a therapist to do something different? My hunch is quite good. He's pro-authoritarian, he follows direction well, he just needs to be directed. We look at, with the eraser, we also look at historical sexual assaults. Has Joe experienced sexual abuse? Has somebody been messing with his sexual development? Has he been exposed to ideas that he's not developmentally able to manage? Has he had So that kind of experience. But what else has he done? So if Joe has gone out and assaulted his niece and 5 other nieces, you've got a bigger problem if he's got 5 nieces or kids in the community. But if it's just one niece, then that's instructive about how to build a safety plan, especially if he has access to others. Has he done it more than once? So the same victim but multiple times. So greater frequency suggests, again, a likelihood that if he had access to that child again, he would do it again, but not necessarily another child, right? So you have to look at that. Has he been caught and sanctioned before, and how did he react to the sanctions? One of the things that happens in a lot of adolescent sex offender groups is that we go through and give them a safety plan. And it's one safety plan for all kids in the group. And then you ask the youth, did you have a safety plan? Yep. Did you follow your safety plan? Nope. Why? I don't know. Well, what was your safety plan? Never be alone with kids. And that's all they remember of their safety plan. Right? So it wasn't a very effective child-specific one. And so they have the safety plan on the file, and they break it. Right? So we want to look at that because it's instructive. But we also want to keep with an FASD thought in mind, is this child capable of remembering a safety plan? Is this child capable of, they may be capable of remembering it, but do they link that to action? And do they connect why the safety plan is there to why they should follow it? And not always. We want to look at threats and coercion. So if Joe is playing with his niece and gets her to do this stuff, versus if he's pinching her or threatening to kill her cat, those are differences. And so we want to know about that. And we also want to know, how did he choose his niece in the first place? Was it availability, or was it something specific to that niece and that situation? Was it something that happens when there's a fight happening in the kitchen? He takes his niece out to the shed to play, and then things evolve. So what is the context of this kid's life? And is there a diversity of sexual behaviors that are happening in that assault? So how complex is this behavior? And so that gives us a sense of how much exposure to different ideas the youth has had and how much practice they're getting. We want to look at psychosocial functioning. So is the child antisocial? Looking at their peer relationships. So for example, a lot of our youth aren't very good at dating. Right? So in a sort of a street culture, they can just go hang out. You don't date. Right? And in schools, they aren't very good at engaging relationships for any length of time because they don't do the socially appropriate things. And sometimes they'll say the wrong thing, or they'll be quite immature compared to their peers. And so they end up with a lot of frustration, and they're not necessarily going to have a girlfriend in the traditional sense. So they look at, but they'll still have the arousal reactions, the sproing factor that teenage boys get in the hallway. I've never been a teenage boy, but they've told me about it. And it's that instant arousal, and what do you do with that when it happens? So if they don't have a girlfriend or somebody that they can appropriately deal with, playing doctor is another way of dealing with it, or forcing a kid to comply so that they get their need met. So we want to know more about that. Do they have negative peers? Like 100% of the youth that I work with that have sexual offending problems are online and are looking at pornography. 100%. And it's not nice porn. It's the kind of porn that they see on satellite dishes, on internet. It's often quite explicit, and often they're looking for the kind of age range that they're attracted to. But if a 14-year-old boy is online looking for 14-year-old girls or 12-year-old girls, and they download a picture, they've now committed a crime. And we're seeing that. The ICE team is finding people who are youth, and they're now in a position where they have to make a decision. Do you charge this child for possession of child pornography when they're looking at peer? And they have cognitive limitations that make it difficult to understand the bigger context. It's a really interesting social issue. And then we want to look at ability to handle negative affect or anger. We want to look at self-regulation in general. So what's the difference between having an impulse and behavior, and can they intervene? So that's a big piece of determining risk for sexual recidivism. The other piece is family and environmental functioning. How stressed is this family? The family environment that he lives in, either the birth family or the where they live, or the combination of where they're living in foster care and chaos in the family of origin. Many of my clients have connections. They're in foster care and have strong connections to their family of origin, and the chaos comes with them, and they go back and forth. Their relationship with their parents is really huge. Is there parental rejection, alienation, that kind of thing? Do the parents support intervention? What we find is that parents don't understand sexually inappropriate behavior. They tend to freak out. They get really excited and angry because one child has hurt another child, and so what do you do? And the helplessness and hopelessness kicks in. So often there's lots of distress and stress in the home. So we want to assess what capacities are within that family to cope with the sexual acting out. And are they able to shift the environment to protect the youth who's engaged in the offending behavior, as well as the youth or the child that's been abused? So how able are they to intervene? We look at all of those factors put together and get a sense of whether this child is at low risk, moderate risk, or high risk. The higher the risk, the more external the structure of containment. So, with FASD youth, we often talk about them needing an external brain. So if we have somebody who is struggling in a huge way, have very few protective factors, are really reactive and impulsive, and living in chaos, that's a good candidate. The child's a good candidate to come into care, and a fairly structured, restrictive care. But if overall they're living in a family that is functioning well, has figured out how to give good messages, has the ability to supervise 24/7, has lots of caregivers coming in to support structure, everybody can know and not shame the child, right, so that the structures are there. You don't necessarily even need to remove the youth from the home, provided that the victim is safe and can be protected. Okay. So the eraser is really a helpful tool because it helps, again, calm down the reaction that, oh my God, this happened. And really helps to look at, well, how likely is this to happen again? And what factors contribute to it happening again? So wherever there's a risk factor that the tool identifies, if it's a risk factor, that's where you strategize for your intervention. So for example, if there's chaos in the family of origin and stability in the foster home or the care home, you may want to do some family work to do that bridge so that the chaos in the family of origin can go down. Some drug treatment, or at least some work to bridge when the kid is making the bridge from visits. We can look at how to increase coping. I do a lot of biofeedback work with FAS youth. Because that reaction is so big and it's a physiological reaction, expecting youth to just get it because we tell them to is not going to be helpful. So we use tools. There's a couple different systems that you can get where a finger pulse goes on the fingers, and there's a video game that the youth, by lowering or raising their arousal level and their reactions, can affect the game. And the youth that I've tried that with have really responded well. So they've been learning more about self-control by playing games. We know that video games are really powerful for kids, and often with FAS youth I recommend video games, not the violent ones, but the reaction-action ones, like for a while their Dance Dance Revolution, did I say that right? Was really helpful because it was physiologically engaging and it was fun, but it also helped people sort of get a good pacing. So they'd learn how to set their movement to action and reaction. So then they'd have to learn how to adjust their behavior to what they were seeing on the screen, which translates very well into adjusting your behavior when you're working with people. So if you see somebody who is not reacting the way you expect them to, these kind of games help you learn to change your behavior. And so using that technology is very helpful. The video games that are connected to the biofeedback are often really eye-openers for the kids because they haven't been aware that they could control their brain. And for some of them, it's been really a difference between sort of feeling hopeless and feeling like there's some opportunity. So again, those kind of strategies are really helpful. We've recommended sometimes in recommendations for sentencing that part of what the kid get involved in is some biofeedback or neurofeedback kind of activities so that it becomes part of helping parents get the kid to the program. So again, we can use probation orders to really support the intervention plans for these kids. Okay. Another piece, when it comes, so we've done the risk assessments and we've brought all this information together and we've written a report that when we have an FASD hypothesis or diagnosis, we've sort of pulled that together and explained the risk factors with that diagnosis in mind. That gives people an opportunity to then make recommendations for sentencing that will work. So for example, having some awareness of the physiological reactions of the child will influence things like where the child lives. So having a child who's highly reactive to others and has a hard time sort of managing their arousal, you might want them living in a foster system or as an only child. If they're with their family of origin, to really strengthen that, that family of origin capacity. But hopefully they can have their own room, so they have places where they can retreat to and have stability. Using technology to support the youth in having good boundaries, so alarms on doors, and not just the kind that alarm when they go off, but alarm when entering spaces that the youth is not supposed to be there, so that the youth gets information that they can then use and be reminded. We often assume that static controls are helpful. So if we put a barrier up, then that's helpful. But kids are not always where they are supposed to be. So again, using technologies like alarms on watches, where are you? It's time to come home, or cell phones and messaging systems to help kids remember what the plans are really helpful. I also recommend things like Tai Chi and yoga. Those are activities that are very good at teaching youth to manage their arousal. The girls are more likely to go to yoga. The guys, not so much. But some of the Tai Chi, it's kind of cool. Taekwondo is also very helpful. The part of Taekwondo that I like is not so much the kicking and the hitting, but the patterns. So at some point they go into kata, so that they have to learn how to pay attention to others and control their body and follow along, but it's in a group. And it's non-literacy based. So those kind of boundary settings are really helpful. And it also helps the kids get a workout and sleep better at night. Right? We often find kids in care are lacking those kind of basic skills, and they haven't been involved in some of the normative kinds of things that other kids are involved in, like music lessons. I have the benefit of having an oboe instructor in the office next to me. And it's incredibly, he's talked about how playing wind instruments teaches kids how to breathe better. And often if you're not sure what's going on in your environment, you have a lot of panic, so you're breathing very shallowly and you're always in arousal mode. By kids learning how to play some of these reed instruments, their arousal comes down because they just feel safer. And I just thought the only difference was that they learned how to play a wind instrument. So that's really powerful. So thinking outside the box, thinking about making recommendations that work with the kids' capacity as well as risk. Encouraging kids to know what the risk factors are, because once we know them from going through these tools, we can then ask them to work with us and see where we go. That's what I had prepared today. Are there any other questions?
Nothing yet.
Nothing yet. How about from our local group? Okay, then I think we can finish.
So Anne-Marie, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. That was truly good. I am thrilled because I'm in a psychology program, so I was taking everything in. So So I was really thrilled. So again, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Please fill out the evaluations. The critical piece to the evaluations is to keep the series ongoing, because we're now going into planning for the fall of 2009 and that year. The next session is on Tuesday, April 21st, I believe 9 to 11, on FASD and practice issues for defense.
2 to 4.
2 to 4 on practice issues for the defense. So we'll see you then. Thank you very much.